The stage lights inside the old Las Vegas theater glowed warm and golden, casting long reflections across polished instruments and velvet curtains. Smoke from cigars drifted lazily above the audience tables, mixing with the low murmur of laughter and clinking glasses. It was the kind of night that only Las Vegas could produce, half glamour, half mystery. And at the center of it all stood Dean Martin. Dean had already been performing for nearly 40 minutes, and the crowd was exactly where he liked them, relaxed, smiling, leaning forward just enough to catch every word of his effortless charm. His voice moved through the room like velvet, smooth, confident, and familiar. For Dean, nights like this were second nature. But something about this evening felt a little different. At one of the tables near the side of the stage sat Clint Eastwood. At the time, Clint was already a rising star in Hollywood, known for his calm, quiet presence and that unmistakable stare that made audiences freeze on movie screens. Yet here in the dim glow of the club, Clint didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a man trying not to be noticed. Clint leaned slightly back in his chair, arms folded, quietly watching Dean perform. A few people had recognized him, but most of the attention remained on the stage. Dean noticed him. Of course he did. Dean Martin had a gift for reading a room the way a conductor reads music. He knew when people were laughing naturally, when someone in the audience had something interesting about them, and when a moment could be turned into magic. And Clint Eastwood sitting quietly in the corner, that was a moment waiting to happen. Dean finished a song to loud applause and raised his glass slightly. "Well now," Dean said with a playful grin, scanning the room, "I see we've got some famous company tonight." The audience began looking around. Clint's expression barely changed, but he knew immediately what was coming. Dean pointed toward him. "Mr. Clint Eastwood." The room suddenly burst into excited murmurs and applause. Clint lifted his hand politely in acknowledgement, though his expression suggested he would have preferred remaining invisible. Dean laughed. "Oh, don't clap too hard, folks," he joked. "You'll make him nervous." The audience laughed. Clint shook his head slightly, smiling. Dean leaned casually against the microphone stand. "You know something about Clint," Dean continued. "Everybody thinks he's just that tough guy from the movies, quiet, serious, doesn't say much." He paused. "But what most people don't know." Dean raised an eyebrow dramatically. "Is that Clint Eastwood can sing." The room erupted with surprised laughter. Clint sat forward slightly. He raised his hands in mock protest. Dean pointed at him again. "Oh yes, my friend," Dean said. "Don't try to hide it now." Clint shook his head slowly. "Dean," he said calmly from his seat, "you're starting trouble." That only made the crowd laugh louder. Dean turned toward the band. "You boys hear that? Clint says I'm starting trouble." The pianist chuckled. Dean stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Tell you what," he said. He pointed directly at Clint. "Why don't you come up here and sing something for us?" The audience immediately burst into applause and cheers. Clint leaned back again, shaking his head firmly. "No chance." Dean placed his hand dramatically over his heart. "No chance," he repeated. He looked toward the audience. "Did you hear that? Clint Eastwood says no chance." Dean paused, then leaned closer to the microphone. "Well, folks," he smiled mischievously, "I think we should convince him." The crowd erupted again. "Clint, Clint, Clint." Clint rubbed his forehead slightly, clearly amused but still resisting. Dean watched him carefully. There was a moment of silence as the crowd waited. Dean knew timing. He lowered his voice. "Clint," he said gently, "come on up here." Then he added with a grin, "Unless you're afraid." The crowd gasped playfully. Clint's eyes narrowed slightly. Dean smiled. Everyone in the room could feel it. The moment had become a challenge. Clint slowly stood. The room exploded with applause. He walked calmly toward the stage, his steps steady, almost reluctant. But there was also a quiet confidence in the way he moved. Dean stepped aside as Clint reached the microphone. Dean leaned toward him and whispered something. Clint chuckled. Dean turned to the band. "All right, boys," he said, Let's see what happens. The band waited. Clint stood at the microphone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The room became completely silent. Then Clint glanced sideways at Dean. "You're enjoying this a little too much," Clint said. Dean nodded proudly. "Absolutely." The crowd laughed again. Clint took a slow breath. "Well," he said calmly, "you asked for it." The band began playing softly. A gentle piano melody filled the room. Dean watched with a curious smile. At first, some people in the audience were still laughing softly, expecting something awkward or funny. But then Clint began to sing. And everything changed. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was warm, deep, and unexpectedly smooth. Within seconds, the laughter disappeared. The room grew quiet again, this time for a completely different reason. Dean's smile slowly faded into something else. Surprise. Clint continued singing, his voice steady and natural, as if he had done this many times before. No theatrics. No showmanship. Just honest music. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Some people exchanged glances. Was this really Clint Eastwood? Even the band members looked slightly stunned. Dean crossed his arms and nodded slowly, impressed. By the time Clint reached the chorus, the entire room was completely silent. No clinking glasses. No whispers. Just the music. When the final note faded into the air, Clint stepped back from the microphone. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room exploded. Thunderous applause. Cheers. Some people even stood up. Dean clapped loudly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he said into the microphone. He turned toward Clint. "You've been hiding that from us." Clint shrugged slightly. "I never said I couldn't sing." Dean laughed. "That was supposed to be a joke." Clint smiled. "Guess the joke's on you." The audience roared with laughter again. Dean put an arm around Clint's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced proudly, "Mr. Clint Eastwood." The applause grew even louder. But something else had happened in that room. The crowd had just witnessed something unexpected, a quiet moment of truth hiding inside what started as a joke. Dean looked out across the audience. "Funny thing about talent," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it shows up when nobody expects it." Clint nodded slightly. And somewhere in the back of the room, an older man whispered to his wife. "That's a moment people will talk about for years." He was right. Because what started as a playful joke between two legends had just revealed something deeper. Sometimes the most powerful surprises happen when someone simply gives another person a chance. And on that night in Las Vegas, Dean Martin had done exactly that. But neither of them realized yet that the story of that night was only beginning. The applause inside the theater didn't fade quickly. It rolled across the room like a wave that refused to settle. People were still standing, still clapping, still whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Clint Eastwood stepped back from the microphone, slightly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. He had spent years standing in front of cameras, playing characters who faced danger without blinking. But standing on a stage with nothing except a microphone and a room full of people staring at him was different. Very different. Dean Martin, however, looked delighted. He leaned toward the microphone again, shaking his head with a grin. "Well, folks," he said, "I invite a man on stage for a joke, and suddenly he steals the whole show." The audience laughed loudly. Clint rubbed the back of his neck, clearly trying to stay out of the spotlight again. Dean looked at him carefully. "You sure you haven't been practicing that somewhere?" Dean asked. Clint gave a quiet smile. "Just a little." Dean raised an eyebrow. "A little?" He turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, that's the most suspicious little I've ever heard." More laughter filled the room. But behind the humor, Dean was genuinely curious. Because something about Clint's voice had surprised him. Not just the quality of it. The confidence. The calm control. Clint hadn't sung like someone trying something new. He had sung like someone who had been carrying music quietly for years. Dean leaned slightly closer to him and lowered his voice. Seriously, he said, where did that come from? Clint shrugged. Long time ago. Dean studied his face. There was a story there, Dean could see it. But Clint clearly wasn't eager to tell it in front of a crowd. Dean understood something important in that moment. The room was still buzzing with excitement, but the real story hadn't happened yet. It was waiting somewhere behind Clint's quiet smile. Dean turned to the band. "All right, boys," he said, clapping his hands once. "Let's give our guest here a break before he starts charging me for stage time." The band began playing again. Dean slipped back into his performance, singing one of his classic songs while the audience slowly returned to their seats. But something had changed in the room. People were no longer just watching a show. They were watching a moment. And every few minutes, someone would glance toward Clint's table again, still amazed by what they had heard. Clint eventually returned to his seat. His friend at the table leaned toward him. "Where did that come from?" the man whispered. Clint smiled faintly. "Old habit." "Old habit," the friend repeated. "You just shocked an entire theater." Clint picked up his drink and stared quietly at the stage. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people only see the parts of you that are loud." The man frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Clint didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched Dean Martin finish another song while the audience cheered again. Then Clint spoke. "Before the movies, before any of this." He paused. "I almost chose something else." His friend looked surprised. "You mean singing?" Clint nodded slightly. Music was always there. The friend leaned back in his chair, clearly fascinated. "Then why didn't you do it?" Clint smiled faintly again. "Because life doesn't always follow the first road, you see." Meanwhile, on stage, Dean Martin was finishing the final song of the set. The crowd stood again in a thunder of applause. Dean bowed slightly. Thank you, you've been wonderful tonight." But before leaving the stage, Dean glanced once more toward Clint's table. Then he pointed again. "And give another hand for Mr. Clint Eastwood." The audience applauded once more. Clint shook his head, embarrassed but amused. Dean finally walked off stage behind the curtain. The moment he stepped backstage, several musicians approached him immediately. "Dean," the pianist said, still surprised, "did you know he could sing like that?" Dean laughed. "Not a clue." Another band member shook his head. That voice, it wasn't amateur. Dean leaned against the wall thoughtfully. "No," he said slowly. "It definitely was." Dean had spent decades in show business. He could recognize something rare when he heard it. And Clint Eastwood had just revealed something rare. Not a perfect performance. Not a trained singer trying to impress people. But something even more powerful. Authenticity. Dean lit a cigarette and thought for a moment. Then he turned toward one of the stage assistants. "Is Clint still out there?" The assistant nodded. "Yes." Dean smiled slightly. "Good." Because Dean Martin had just decided something. The joke earlier might have started as a playful moment. But he had a feeling the story wasn't finished. And Dean Martin loved unfinished stories. Out in the theater, Clint was preparing to leave. The crowd had begun to thin as people headed toward the exits, still talking excitedly about the surprise performance. As Clint stood from his chair, a few fans approached politely. "Mr. Eastwood," one man said, "that was incredible." Clint nodded kindly. "Thank you." Another woman added, "You should record music." Clint chuckled softly. "I think I'll stick to movies." But before Clint could leave, a stage assistant approached him. "Mr. Eastwood." Clint turned. "Yes." "Mr. Martin would like to see you backstage." Clint smiled. "I figured." A few minutes later, Clint walked through the backstage hallway. The atmosphere behind the stage, was completely different from the glamorous theater outside. Cables ran along the floor, musicians laughed and packed instruments. The scent of stage lights and equipment filled the air. And leaning casually, near a doorway stood Dean Martin. Dean looked up as Clint approached. "Well," Dean said, "you survived." Clint smiled. "Barely." Dean laughed. "No, seriously," he said. "You didn't just sing, you surprised me." Clint leaned against the wall beside him. "That wasn't the plan." Dean nodded. "I know." Then Dean studied him again. "You ever think about doing it seriously?" Clint shook his head. "That ship sailed." Dean wasn't convinced. "You sure?" Clint looked toward the floor for a moment. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "life pushes you into a role, and before you realize it, everyone only sees you that way." Dean understood exactly what he meant. Dean Martin himself had been labeled many things over the years. Singer, comedian, actor, playboy, but people rarely understood the quiet parts of a person. Dean flicked ash from his cigarette. "You know something, Clint." Clint looked up. Dean smiled. "That voice of yours, it's honest." Clint raised an eyebrow. "That's a strange compliment." Dean shrugged. "In this business, honesty is rare." The hallway grew quiet. Then Dean said something that surprised Clint. "You should sing again tomorrow night." Clint laughed. "You're joking." Dean shook his head. "I'm not." Clint crossed his arms. "Dean, tonight was a joke that got out of control." Dean smiled slowly. "Exactly." He leaned closer. "And the audience loved it." Clint thought about it for a moment. Then he shook his head again. "No." Dean sighed dramatically. "You're stubborn." Clint nodded. "Very." Dean chuckled. "All right." He dropped the cigarette into a nearby tray. "But someday," Dean said calmly, "someone is going to ask you to sing again." Clint looked at him curiously. "And?" Dean smiled. "And when that happens." He pointed toward the stage. "Don't hide it." Clint stood quietly for a moment. Then he nodded. "Maybe." The two men shook hands, and neither of them realized something important. That small moment backstage, a simple conversation between two performers, would stay in Clint's mind for years. Because sometimes the most powerful encouragement doesn't come in a speech. It comes in a quiet sentence, spoken at exactly the right moment. And long after the lights of that Las Vegas theater faded, Clint Eastwood would remember Dean Martin's words. But the real test of those words hadn't happened yet. Months passed after that unforgettable night in Las Vegas. For most people who had been in the audience, it became one of those stories told again and again at dinner tables and bars. Did you hear Clint Eastwood sing? Some people believed it. Others didn't. But the memory of that moment never completely disappeared. And for Clint Eastwood, the memory followed him more quietly than anyone realized. Life moved forward quickly. Film sets, long shooting schedules, scripts to read, directors calling, producers waiting. Clint returned to the world people knew him for, the world of cameras, western landscapes, and silent characters who spoke more through their eyes than their words. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. But something small had changed. Sometimes late at night after filming, Clint would sit alone in his trailer or in a quiet hotel room. And occasionally, he would hum a melody. Not loudly. Not long. Just a few notes. Then he would stop. Because music was something Clint had learned to keep to himself. It had always been that way. Long before Hollywood, before fame, before movie posters with his face on them, Clint had spent time listening to music wherever he could find it. Small clubs, radio stations, quiet piano bars. Music had always been there. But acting had taken over his life. And the world had quickly decided who Clint Eastwood was supposed to be. A tough man. A quiet hero. A figure who walked into danger and never looked nervous. Singing didn't quite fit that image. And Clint had never been interested in fighting the expectations of the world. Until one afternoon, when something unexpected happened. Clint was filming on a Western movie set in California. The sun was hot, the air dusty, and the crew was preparing for a long scene that involved horses and several difficult camera angles. During a break between shots, Clint walked toward the edge of the set to get some fresh air. A few crew members sat nearby drinking coffee. Someone had brought a small radio. Soft music played in the background. Clint leaned against a wooden fence, listening absent-mindedly. Then suddenly, a familiar voice came through the radio. Smooth, warm, relaxed. Dean Martin. The radio host spoke between songs. And that was Dean Martin, one of the most recognizable voices in entertainment. Clint smiled faintly. He hadn't seen Dean since that night in Las Vegas. But hearing his voice instantly brought the memory back. The stage lights. The laughter. The moment Dean had challenged him to sing. Clint shook his head slightly. One of the crew members noticed. You like Dean Martin? Clint nodded. Yeah. The man grinned. Who does? Another crew member joined the conversation. I saw him perform once in Vegas. The guy's unbelievable. Clint didn't say anything. Then the first man joked. Imagine if someone like you sang on stage with him. Clint laughed softly. Yeah, he said. Imagine that. The conversation moved on, but Clint stayed where he was, staring toward the distant hills. Because something Dean had said that night suddenly echoed in his mind again. Someday someone is going to ask you to sing again. Clint exhaled slowly. Not likely, he murmured. But life has a strange way of proving people wrong. A few weeks later, Clint attended a charity event in Los Angeles. The room was elegant and filled with familiar faces from the entertainment industry. Actors, musicians, producers, people who had spent their lives in front of audiences. At the front of the room stood a small stage with a piano. The event organizer stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly, thank you for coming tonight to support a great cause. The audience applauded. Several performers took turns speaking and entertaining the crowd. Then suddenly the host smiled. And now, he said, we have a special surprise. The room quieted. The host looked toward Clint's table. Mr. Clint Eastwood. Clint froze. The entire room turned toward him. The host continued. I heard a rumor recently, he said playfully. A rumor that Mr. Eastwood has a very impressive singing voice. The audience chuckled. Clint immediately recognized what was happening. Someone had heard the story, and now the story had followed him. Clint shook his head slowly. But the host wasn't finished. Mr. Eastwood, he said, smiling kindly, would you honor us with a song tonight? The room filled with applause. Clint stayed seated. For a moment, the old instinct returned. The instinct to stay quiet. To stay in the role the world expected. He could simply refuse politely. Everyone would understand. But then something else happened. Across the room, Clint noticed an older man sitting at one of the back tables. The man looked tired, but his eyes were full of hope. Beside him sat a young child, no older than 10, clapping excitedly along with the crowd. Clint suddenly remembered why this event existed. It was a charity event for children facing serious illness. The applause continued. The child at the back table looked toward Clint with a hopeful smile. And suddenly Clint remembered something else. Dean Martin's voice. That quiet moment backstage. When that happens, don't hide it. Clint slowly stood. The room erupted into louder applause. He walked toward the stage calmly, though inside he felt something he rarely felt. Nervous, not because of fear, but because this moment meant something. He reached the microphone. The host stepped aside respectfully. Clint looked out across the room. Hundreds of faces stared back. Waiting. Clint took a breath. Well, he said slowly, I guess rumors travel faster than expected. The audience laughed. Clint glanced toward the piano player. You know, always on my mind. The pianist nodded. Clint closed his eyes for a second. Then the piano began to play. Soft, simple. The room became silent, and Clint Eastwood began to sing. This time the voice was stronger, more confident, but still honest. The kind of voice that didn't try to impress people. It simply told the truth of the song. By the second verse, several people in the room had stopped smiling, because the performance no longer felt like a surprise. It felt like something deeper, something personal. When Clint finished the final line, the room remained silent for 2 seconds. Then applause exploded through the hall. People stood, clapped, some even wiped tears from their eyes. Clint stepped away from the microphone, slightly overwhelmed. But before leaving the stage, he glanced once more toward the back table. The young child was clapping harder than anyone else. And smiling. Clint nodded slightly. In that moment, he understood something important. Dean Martin had been right. Sometimes talent isn't about fame. Sometimes it isn't about careers. Sometimes it's simply about sharing something real when the moment asks for it. And on that night, Clint Eastwood didn't hide the music anymore. But the most powerful part of the story was still waiting, because someone else had been watching that performance very closely. And that person was about to change everything. The applause from the charity event seemed to echo long after the room had emptied. For many of the people who attended that night, Clint Eastwood's performance had been unexpected, but unforgettable. Yet Clint himself didn't see it that way. To him, it had simply been a moment that felt right. After the event ended, guests slowly began leaving the hall. Conversations filled the room again, people discussing the music, the performances, and the powerful cause behind the evening. Clint stepped off the stage quietly. He never liked too much attention. A few people approached him with smiles and compliments. Mr. Eastwood, that was incredible. Your voice was beautiful. You should record an album. Clint responded politely to each person, but he kept his answers short. Thank you. Glad you enjoyed it. But inside, Clint wasn't thinking about praise. He was thinking about someone else. Dean Martin. Because the moment Clint stepped away from the microphone earlier that night, Dean's words had returned to him again. When that moment comes, don't hide it. Clint had almost forgotten how clearly Dean had said it. Almost. As Clint walked toward the exit of the hall, the event organizer approached him quickly. Mr. Eastwood, the man said. Clint turned. Yes. The organizer smiled. Someone asked me to give you this. He handed Clint a small folded note. Clint looked at it curiously. From who? He asked. The organizer shrugged. He didn't say his name. Clint opened the note slowly. The message inside was short. Only one sentence. But the moment Clint read it, he froze. The note said, "Looks like you finally stopped hiding that voice." Clint smiled, because he recognized the handwriting instantly. Dean Martin. Clint looked up quickly. Where is he? Clint asked. The organizer pointed toward the back of the hall. He was sitting back there earlier. I think he stepped outside. Clint nodded. Thanks. He walked through the crowd calmly, but his pace was faster now. When Clint pushed open the large doors leading outside the hall, cool night air greeted him. The city lights of Los Angeles stretched across the horizon. And standing near the edge of the sidewalk, leaning casually against a car, was Dean Martin. Dean looked exactly the same as Clint remembered. Relaxed, confident, and smiling like someone who had just enjoyed a very good joke. Dean raised his hand slightly. Well, he said. Took you long enough. Clint walked toward him. I didn't know you were here. Dean shrugged. I heard there might be some singing tonight. Clint chuckled. So you came to check the rumor? Dean nodded. And I wasn't disappointed. The two men stood quietly for a moment, looking out across the city lights. Then Dean said something unexpected. You know, he said calmly, that was better than Vegas. Clint raised an eyebrow. You're kidding. Dean shook his head. No. He looked toward Clint. In Vegas, you sang because I tricked you. He paused. Tonight you sang because you chose to. Clint considered that for a moment. Dean continued. And that makes all the difference. Clint leaned against the nearby railing. You planned this, didn't you? Clint asked. Dean smiled. I might have told someone about that Vegas night. Clint laughed. So the rumor was your fault. Dean raised his hands. I prefer the word inspiration. The two men shared a quiet laugh. But then Dean's tone softened slightly. You saw that kid in the back row, didn't you? Clint nodded. Yeah. Dean looked down at the sidewalk. That's why I came tonight. Clint looked at him. What do you mean? Dean exhaled slowly. I met that boy earlier today. Clint waited. Dean continued quietly. He told me his favorite movie star was Clint Eastwood. Clint blinked in surprise. And then he told me something else. Dean paused. He said he wished he could hear Clint Eastwood sing. Clint stared at him. Dean smiled gently. So I thought maybe the rumor should come true. For a moment, Clint didn't know what to say. Dean Martin had spent his entire life making people laugh. But in that moment, Clint saw something deeper. Kindness. Quiet kindness. Clint shook his head slightly. You set the whole thing up. Dean grinned. Let's just say I gave the universe a little push. Clint laughed again. You're unbelievable. Dean looked toward the sky. Maybe. Then he added softly. But that kid will remember tonight for the rest of his life. Clint thought about that. And suddenly, he understood something that had taken years to fully realize. Music wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't even about careers. Sometimes it was simply about giving someone a moment they would never forget. Dean straightened his jacket. Well, he said, I should go before someone asks me to sing. Clint smiled. That would be tragic. Dean laughed. He started walking toward his car, then paused and looked back at Clint one last time. You know something. Clint waited. Dean pointed toward him. You're still hiding a little. Clint raised an eyebrow. Dean smiled. But not as much as before. With that, Dean got into the car. The engine started. The car slowly disappeared down the quiet street. Clint remained standing there for a long time, watching the empty road, thinking about everything that had happened since that first night in Las Vegas. A joke, a challenge, a voice he once kept hidden, and a friend who refused to let him hide it forever. Clint smiled quietly to himself, because sometimes the most powerful encouragement doesn't come from applause. It comes from one person believing you shouldn't keep something beautiful locked away. Years later, people would still talk about that charity event. They would talk about the moment Clint Eastwood surprised the room with a song no one expected. But very few people ever knew the full story. They didn't know about the night in Las Vegas. They didn't know about the quiet conversation backstage. And they didn't know about the small note written by Dean Martin. But Clint knew. And every time he heard music playing softly somewhere, he remembered something important. Sometimes the greatest talent isn't the one that performs the loudest. Sometimes it's the one that waits quietly, until the right moment arrives. And thanks to Dean Martin, Clint Eastwood had finally found that moment.